Welcome. For about the last 60 years or so, there has been a large and growing conflict between what I would call the environmental movement and what I might call freedom and human prosperity and human thriving. The environmental movement has tended to focus on uh, what it considers to be catastrophic problems affecting our environment in terms of pollution or resource depletion or species extinction. And most importantly, over the last 30 years or so, climate change, man made climate change. And this evening on From the Stacks, my guest, Dr. David Legates, and I are going to talk a bit about this. And we're particularly going to focus on some ideas that we're going to be presenting at a conference that we will be offering in Memphis, or actually just outside of Memphis, this coming Friday and Saturday. If you're not in the Memphis area and not able to attend, I would encourage you to be in touch with your leaders at your church or at your school, other organization. We would love to bring this conference to wherever you are around the United States, around Canada, around the world, as a matter of fact, if we can arrange that. So we'd love to do this. The conference title is Thinking Biblically About Earth's Stewardship and the Conquest of Poverty in the Age of Climate Change. It's something that we think that a lot of people are going to find very, very helpful. Before David joins me here, I would like to just remind you that this program is brought to you by the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, and that you can find us on the web at cornwallalliance.org. That's cornwallalliance.org. And every month we offer an educational resource as our way of saying thank you when you make a 100% tax deductible donation of literally any size, doesn't matter how large or how small, and request it. This month, what we're offering is actually 2 copies of this booklet, Social Justice versus Biblical Justice, How Good Intentions Undermine Justice and Gospel. This booklet carefully defines justice out of the scriptures themselves, right out of the Bible. And then it compares that definition of justice with definitions that are common in the social justice movement. The biblical definition of justice, if I can state it very, very succinctly, is that justice means rendering impartially and proportionally to everyone his due in accord with the righteous standard of God's moral law. Social justice turns out to be something very, very different. It tends to go along with notions that outcomes should be equal, not just treatment. That if there's an inequality in wealth or in income or in power or in privilege, in even living conditions of any kind, access to education or healthcare or whatever else, if there are any real differences, somehow or other that's unjust. Social justice demands that there be equality of outcome and often even equality of opportunity. In other circles, we tend to think, well, equality of outcome just can't be achieved, but equality of opportunity is fine. I question even that in this booklet on the grounds that, in fact, it's mythical. There is no such thing as equality of opportunity. Where we're born, when we're born, to whom we're born, all of those things affect us. Are we tall? Are we short? Are we physically strong? Are we physically weak? Are we more inclined toward physical activity or toward mental activity? Do we enjoy this, that, or another thing, or something else? All of those things are inequalities that actually are things that we ought to celebrate, but they're also inequalities that mean that we cannot all have the same opportunity to do the same things. So in social justice versus biblical justice, I carefully contrast the biblical definition of justice with the definitions that tend to come in the social justice movement. And I also explore the implications for understanding of rights, And the distinction between what are called positive rights, those that are posited by legislation, by regulation, by human authorities, versus negative rights. Positive rights tend to be rights to particular benefits. Negative rights, by contrast, are rights against harms. Negative rights can all, at least theoretically, be satisfied without stepping on anybody's toes. Positive rights, rights to benefits, cannot. Because if I have a right to a benefit that I don't already possess, and I'm not capable of going out and obtaining that by trading something with someone else, then my right to that benefit can be served only if that benefit is taken away from someone else. So negative rights as protection against harms are self-consistent. Positive rights as demands for particular benefits are inconsistent, are self-refuting. So I explore all of that in this booklet. And the aim is to provide Christians, especially conservatives, even who are not Christians, with a solid understanding of how they can show the alternative to the social justice, woke, progressive movement. So this month, we're giving away 2 free copies of this to anyone who requests them as our way of saying thank you when you make a donation of literally any size and request it. To request yours, just go to cornwallalliance.org. That's cornwallalliance.org. Click on the donate button. And then as you fill out the donation form, in the comments field, write in promo code 22-03. That's promo code 22-03, or the title Social Justice, and we'll know to send you 2 copies of Social Justice versus Biblical Justice. So my guest tonight is Dr. David Legates, and I really shouldn't even refer to him as a guest anymore. David has become the Director of Research and Education for the Cornwall Alliance, and we have a special announcement coming up late in the program today about what he and I are going to be doing together in the future. But first, the 2 of us are just going to talk a bit about this conference that we have coming up Friday and Saturday at Graceview Church. That's Graceview Church on Swinney Road in South Haven, Mississippi. That's just on the south edge of Memphis. And we would love for any of you who are within reasonable driving distance of Memphis to come and enjoy this conference with us. Friday night, it goes 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. Saturday morning, 9 a.m. to noon. David and I will be presenting 2 lectures apiece, 2 talks apiece. There will be plenty of question and answer time, and you'll have access to a table full of educational resources from the Cornwall Alliance that are also available there. There is no charge to come into the conference. It's totally free, and you can sign up for it by going to our website and looking for Thinking Biblically About Earth Stewardship and the Conquest of Poverty. You can also go to our Facebook page, Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation on Facebook, and we have a prominent announcement about the conference there as well. Well, now I would like to welcome David Legates to come alongside me here. And ordinarily, my guests and I have been on different computers in totally different parts of the world, but David and I get to be here together for this program. David, tell folks a bit about yourself so that they know who you are, what your background is, and then we'll jump into talking about the conference.
Well, I'm David Legates. I used to be professor of climatology and in particular at the University of Delaware. And at this point, I'm retired. And so now I'm pleased to be working for the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation.
David is the author or co-author of 150 some refereed journal articles. He's taught climatology for many years at the University of Delaware, at Louisiana State.
Louisiana State University, the University of Oklahoma.
Yeah, yeah. And he and Dr. Anthony Lupo were co-authors with the late Fred Singer, Fred Singer, one of the legendary American physicists, of the wonderful book, Hot Talk, Cold Science, Global Warming's Unfinished Debate, third edition, that came off the press just about a year ago now, and has really stirred things up in terms of the debate over man-made climate change, man-made global warming. So David became our director of research and education back in January, and we are delighted to have him on. So this Friday and Saturday, we're presenting this conference, Thinking Biblically About Earth Stewardship and the Conquest of Poverty in the Age of Climate Change. And David, you're going to be doing the first talk, the first presentation for that. Give us just a bit of an appetizer for that, if you will.
Well, it's titled Biblical Perspectives of Environmental Stewardship. It's essentially an annotated discussion of the Cornwall Alliance for the Cornwall Declaration for the Stewardship of Creation. And essentially that is going through and talking about why we are to do what we should do with respect to being good stewards of our environment, particularly with respect to following Matthew 22, which is where we want to honor God and give glory to God, and then to help our neighbors.
Yeah, one of the documents that is providing some background for this talk by David is one on Cornwall Alliance's website called Biblical Perspective of Environmental Stewardship, Subduing and Ruling the Earth to the Glory of God and the Benefit of Our Neighbors. This is a document in the form of affirmations and denials. We affirm this, we deny this that is inconsistent with it. And so David's going to be walking through some of those points. Frankly, there are far too many to cover in about a 45 to 50-minute lecture, but he's going to hit the high points, and that should be really very, very helpful. David, one of those high points is based on Genesis 1:28, that when God had created Adam and Eve, male and female, in his own image, he blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over it." Why don't you just expand a little bit on that?
Well, the question has been, when it says have dominion and subdue, it gives sort of the impression that we are to be controlling and powering and sort of like a tyrant. But we've got to go back to Matthew and remember that our particular goal is to glorify God and to help others and treat others as we would treat ourselves. And the important thing of that is that if we were to act like a tyrant and act like a domineering person over the environment, then that would not be very godlike. That would be certainly not helping our neighbor. But the idea of being ruling and having dominion over is to control it, but use it for the betterment of ourselves and for the furtherment of God. And I think that's the key thing that Genesis is trying to get across, as opposed to what environmentalists try to view as where we are to become servants or slaves in some cases of the environment, and to try to keep it pristine and in the condition in which it exists right now.
Yeah, in one of his parables, Jesus talks about, we typically hear it referred to as the parable of the talents, where he uses a landowner as a representative of God in this parable. The landowner hires various people during the day, and he pays them all the same amount at the end of the day, though they work different periods of time for him. And some of those who worked the most hours complain, and he responds to them that it was perfectly okay for him to do this because, after all, they had agreed with him for the wage that he paid them. and the money that belonged that he paid, it belonged to him, and he was free to do this, and they were free to accept or reject the offer in the first place. But then the one who, I'm telling the wrong parable. All this time, I'm telling the wrong parable. I'm thinking instead. I should be thinking of the parable. Well, I called it the parable of the talents, and I was doing the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. Okay, which also has its own economic lessons. But in the parable of the talents, David, the landowner or the master. You tell it.
Well, no.
No, you go ahead and tell it, David.
I was just going to say, the master has 3 slaves, and the master is going away on a trip somewhere, and he gives one 5 talents, and one 3 talents, and one 1 talent, or is it 5, 2, and 1?
5, 2, and 1.
5, 2, and 1, I believe it is. So he gives he goes away, and he comes back, and at the end he says to them, "What have you done?" Essentially, and the one with 5 talents says, "Here are your 5 talents back, and here's 5 more that I've done with it." And he says, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." And then he goes to the one with 2, and he says, "Here are your 2 talents back, and here's 2 more that I have learned with it." And he says, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." And essentially the third one comes in and says, "Well, you know what happened? I took that 1 talent and I bet it on the 5th camel with the 3rd race in Haifa. I thought it was going to win. It didn't. Oh, well." No, of course he didn't do that. What he said was, "I've hid it in the ground. Here is exactly what you've given to me, and I'm giving back to you. I've protected it. I've given it to you in the exact case that you've given it to me." And of course, the master says, "Thou lazy slave, why didn't you put it to work? Essentially, I gave you that talent to do something with. You have simply hid it in the ground. It has done nothing while I've been gone." And that's the concern that I have, is that the parallel of hiding the talents in the ground and keeping our natural resources in the ground is really a stark contrast to what we see in environmentalism. We're now told even keep fossil fuels in the ground so that we don't use them, because if we do, somehow it's going to create warming of temperatures, and that in turn is going to create a condition that essentially we are going to be under very serious environmental constraints. So therefore, let's keep our resources in the ground so that when God comes back, we can present them to him and say, "See, here is what you gave to us. Here it is exactly in the form in which you presented it." And he will say, "Thou lazy slave, why didn't you use it to help the poor among us? Why didn't you use that to help glorify my name?"
Yeah. Psalm 115, verse 16 says, "The heavens, even the highest heavens, belong to the Lord, but the earth he has given to men, to the sons of men." And it's very common for a lot of Christians, especially, who begin to get into the environmental movement and sort of creation care kind of thinking, to figure, well, really, Psalm 24:1 says the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So it belongs to God. So we really don't have any right to do anything much with it. We should just try to keep it as much as possible as we find it. And that's actually a very common notion among secular environmentalists, that the earth is best untouched by human hands. But if we realize from Psalm 115:16 that God has given the earth to the sons of men, and that he has filled it with all kinds of wonderful raw materials that when we apply our minds to them, we can turn into resources that are very helpful to our neighbors, then if we're just kind of packing everything away, keep it in the ground is actually a popular motto now, as David referred to in the anti-fossil fuels movement. If that's what we're doing, we're really being like that third servant in the parable of the talents. And we're just, burying the talent and giving it back to God. No, God doesn't want us to give the earth back to him exactly as he gave it to us. He wants us to give the earth back to him in a different form. That's clear from Genesis 1:28 itself, which says that we're supposed to subdue the earth and have dominion over it, rule over it. Well, wouldn't need any subduing if he wanted it back exactly as he gave it to us. What that indicates is that God made the earth so that it would be the appropriate stage, the appropriate setting for us to work out what it means to be made in the image of God, and to follow his example in dominion, an example in which he started with nothing and got everything. He started with darkness and brought in light. He started with disorder and brought tremendous order. He started without life and brought life, and he brought great variety of life. And so we too should be wanting to bring more and more out of less and less. We should be wanting to bring knowledge, truth, light out of darkness, out of ignorance, out of falsehood. We should be wanting to bring greater order out of lesser order, and life out of non-life, and great abundance of life. All of these things are things that we can do, and as we do those, we're being like those two servants who were given 5 or 2 talents and who doubled them. Our aim should be to present the earth back to the Lord in a condition that is actually better than that in which he gave it to us. And, it may seem really strange that we could give something back to God in a better condition than what he gave it to us. But surely he didn't mean, when he told us to subdue and rule the earth, that we were supposed to present it back to him in a worse condition. The fact is that he intended from the very start to employ us, to make us his partners in this ongoing work, not of making something out of nothing, that original creation only God could do, but of actually improving what he made in the first place. He wants to employ us that way. He wants us to be co-creators, co-stewards with him over this earth. So that's the first talk. One tiny taste out of it. You'll see a whole lot of other things. The second talk in the conference will be mine, and that is titled, "What Economic Order Best Protects Nature While Overcoming Poverty?" And in this talk, I'll be comparing a more sort of government planned economy, whether you call it socialism or communism or mixed economy or an industrial policy economy, something like that, versus a more free market economy. And of course, you can't absolutize any of these. There is no perfectly socialist economy, never has been. There is no perfect market economy, never has been. But we're talking about economies that are sort of on a spectrum, on a continuum from the least free to the most free. And the question is, which sort of economy better provides for both conquering poverty, delivering people out of poverty, making them prosperous and helping them to thrive, to be healthy, to have long lives, and to enjoy physical abundance, which is itself often spoken of in Scripture as a blessing from God. And what economy, what sort of economy least serves that? Not only that, but also what economy best serves the aim of having a clean, healthful, beautiful environment, and what sort of economy least serves that. And David, you, I know, have done a fair amount of reading in this area as well. You've been concerned about the importance of preserving freedom in a world that is in many ways being guided in an opposite direction by a lot of the environmental movement. What do you see as sort of the dominant themes of much of environmentalism that you see as concerning, as reasons for caution as to how it affects our freedom, as well as our prosperity and even the quality of the natural order?
Well, I've been reading Peter Jones's 1 or 2. If you're not familiar with that book, it's essentially talking about the concept of either oneism where God, creation, and everything are one unit, one being, one substance, or whether you're twoism, as Christianity is, where the creator is distinct and different from the creation, and although the creator can come and become creation, and creator can essentially interact with creation, they are separate and distinct entities altogether. And I think that's the problem that we're seeing in a lot of the environmentalist movement, is they're headed towards this concept of oneism, where essentially there is God is nature and nature is God, and they're all wrapped together. The idea was at some point there was a thought that there was going to be some form of secular humanism take over, where it would be atheism. And I'm afraid that what we're really seeing is not an atheism. It's really a new, well, it's an old theism, it's pantheism, but it's essentially the old worship of nature, worship of things, and worshiping the creation as sort of coming back to life.
Yeah, a variety of different philosophers of religion have said that whatever people consider to be their ultimate concern is, for all practical purposes, their God. And so then, if we apply that insight to secular humanism, we realize that that when you think of nature, material reality, matter and energy in motion as all that is, well, that's ultimate. That's your ultimate concern. And what that means is that you've turned the universe itself, you've turned the material cosmos into your God. And so you're really not into atheism there, you're into materialistic sort of pantheism. It's just as religious as pantheism itself, the sort of thing that we find in Hinduism and some forms of Buddhism or Taoism. And it's just as religious as animism, the notion that there are all sorts of little gods or spirits that inhabit rocks and trees and so on. Secular humanism, materialism, naturalism is definitely religious, but it's a type of religion that is monist or oneist. All reality is just basically one. And when you go there, that means basically you are denying all kinds of distinctions. Oh, goodness gracious, about 30 years ago or so, I wrote an article for World Magazine, which at the time was fairly young in its existence, in which I argued that socialism was the path toward homosexuality, toward the denial of distinction between male and female. And at the time, I think this was a pretty revolutionary sort of a thought. But the reality is that that's exactly what we've observed happening since then. Socialism denies distinctions between mine and yours. Socialism denies distinctions between one and two. Socialism denies the distinction between God the Creator and the universe, His creation. And it should not be any huge surprise to us then that today we're not only denying the distinction between the fittedness of males and females for each other for marriage, we're denying the distinction between male and female entirely. We have a nominee to the Supreme Court who tells a senator she cannot provide a definition of a woman. We have now biological males calling themselves women, competing in women's sports, and going from way down around number 500 in the world's list of male swimmers, men swimmers, to number 1 in a women's swim meet. These things all come from this denial of what Peter Jones in his book, One or Two, is calling the importance of the binary. And we're in a culture that wants to deny the binary. that becomes really relevant to the issue of what sort of economic order best protects the environment in the very fact that private property is essential to human incentive to take good care of something. I've said many times, this is why we find graffiti on public bathroom walls, but not on your bathroom wall at home. Because you own your bathroom at home, you own the house, and you have an incentive to take good care of that so that it has a good resale value. But what everybody owns, nobody owns. What nobody owns, nobody has an incentive to take good care of. So private property, mine, not yours. Yours, not your neighbor's. Private property is essential to good environmental stewardship. And yet, what we have is an increasing demand on the part of many environmentalists to turn over, if not the ownership, at least the control of more and more property to government through regulation and take it out of the control of private hands. So in this talk, what economic order best protects nature while overcoming poverty, I argue that, in fact, it is the free market economy that does a much better job of both. This reflects, it grows out of a short book that I wrote called Is Capitalism Bad for the Environment?, in which I carefully compare the actual historical track records of capitalism and socialism. So this is a lecture, a talk that I think many people will find helpful. David, your next one, and those two will be on Friday night. Saturday morning, David will open up with a history of the climate change movement. Tell us a bit about that one, David.
Well, generally, I often give talks on climate change and talk about the facts associated with what we're seeing in terms of the climate. But in particular, the question always arises, why is it that the facts are completely different than what we're told in the press? So when you read in the press, we see that hurricanes are becoming more intense, tornadoes are becoming more frequent, more intense. We're seeing more hurricanes, we're seeing more floods, we're seeing more droughts. But when we look at the record, we're not seeing any more of those. So the question is, why is that happening? And what I go through in here is a discussion of the history of a sort of how we got to the point where the facts and the actual what you're told are completely different. So it's the history of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, how they came to be, the players that were involved, and why, as I conclude usually all of my talks, it's no longer, climate change discussion is no longer about the climate, and it hasn't been for an awful long time.
Yeah. Let's see. There was a German economist, Ottmar Edenhofer. Do you remember what it was that he said in coming up toward, I think it was the Cancun Climate Summit?
I can't remember the exact quote, but I know he and Christiana Figueres and AOC's chief of staff have all had similar comments that this isn't really about climate change. You think, her chief of staff essentially said, you think the Green New Deal is about climate change? That's not what we think of it. We think of it as we're going to change the economic system type of thing. And that's the same thing Edenhofer's comment says, and Figueres' comment is this is really a way to change the economic system using climate change as the vehicle to get it accomplished. So as I said, it's not about changing the climate. It's not about saving us from us changing the climate. It's about what can we do, or how can we leverage the climate in order to get a complete change in the way the world does business. And it's really an anti-capitalist, globalist, if you want, type of approach.
Yeah. One little bit of what Edenhofer said was something like, we must not think about the climate summit as an environmental meeting. It has nothing, this is, I think, actual exact words, it has nothing to do with the environment. And he goes on, it's really all about we redistribute de facto the world's wealth through this. And he was, why is he important? Who the heck is Ottmar Edenhofer anyway? Well, he was chairman of Working Group 3 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Working Group 3 is all about, okay, what are we going to do about climate change? How are we going to respond to this? And the answer apparently is, we're going to redistribute the world's wealth, as if somehow or other that's going to change global temperatures and change the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. That clearly is not the case, and it really reveals, it exposes an underlying agenda behind all of this.
And Christiana Figueres was head of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change at the recent COP meeting. And so she is very much in power, in charge of things that are going on at the UN.
Yeah. And explain the relationship between the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and, say, the Paris Climate Agreement.
Well, essentially what happens is in a nutshell, the IPCC meets to produce a document that comes out approximately every 5 years, usually a little bit late, but it comes out. And then approximately 2 years after that, there's a meeting, sometimes in Paris, sometimes it's been in a variety of different places. But the idea is then they attempt to enact a policy to try to effectively minimize the climate. So the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change goes hand in hand with the previous release of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So the one releases a document talking about Working Group 1, which is science, Working Group 2, which is the impacts, and essentially Working Group 3, which is the mitigation procedure. And those documents then get out into circulation for about 2 years. Then the countries of the world get together and say, okay, what are we going to do about it? And the pressure is to make the developed nations of the world kick in money, to kick in economic strangleholds, if you will, and then provide that money essentially to the UN, to other non-governmental organizations, but also to developing countries to help them essentially bring their system up a little bit. But there's often a concern as we shouldn't really allow the third world to develop. It's sort of that noble native concept that if they become like us, why they're going to be victims of climate change. So it would be better if they remained in the somehow poor and undeveloped state that they were in.
Yeah, and the Framework Convention on Climate Change is a treaty as well as an organization. It's a treaty organization. The treaty was signed, I believe it was 1992 at the big Rio Environmental Summit put on by the UN, the United Nations. And under that are all the negotiations for the later treaties or protocols or agreements or whatever you might happen to call them. The Kyoto Protocol was put together in 1999, and it was set to expire in 2009, I think, and we were supposed to replace that with a new treaty negotiated at Copenhagen in 2009, and that failed, and we didn't manage to get a new one put together until Paris in 2015. And all of these things, it's really amazing. David, what would happen if all the countries in the world actually fulfilled their stated intentions in terms of trying to mitigate global warming? What would happen to global average temperature if they did that?
Global average temperature, my answer to your question was almost going to be virtually nothing with respect to the climate. There's virtually no change in temperature. There has, despite all of these treaties, despite all of the concerns over the years, carbon dioxide increases have not changed one bit. And so everything that has gone on has had virtually no impact on the climate. And that's the key thing, is that it's billed as a climate treaty as to save the planet, but it has no impact on anything that's going on the planet with respect to the climate. Now, with respect to economics, with respect to wealth redistribution, with respect to power and control, lots of things got changed and have been changed and will be changed.
Yeah.
And that's why I say this really is not about the climate, and it hasn't been for an awful long time.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, just a reminder that to the end of the month of March, and we're getting pretty close, so you need to act pretty quickly if you want to take advantage of this offer. The Cornwall Alliance will send 2 copies, totally free, of Social Justice versus Biblical Justice, How Good Intentions Undermine Justice and Gospel, as our way of saying thank you when you make a donation of literally any size, doesn't matter how large or how small. All you need to do to request yours is go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill in the donation form, when you come to the comments field, write in promo code 22-03, that's 22-03, or the title Social Justice versus Biblical Justice. We'll send you 2 copies so that you have one for yourself and one for a friend. Or if you've already had this in the past, and many of you have, and this is part of why we're offering it again, is that so many of you have told us that it's been very, very helpful in communicating with others. If you already have a copy, now you have 2 copies to give away to friends. I would especially encourage you to give them to teachers at nearby schools, public schools, if you can have contact with teachers there, or private Christian schools, or certainly pastors and elders could benefit from reading this book. All right, so David, the last talk of our conference will be mine, titled Climate Change and the Poor, Guidelines for Passionate Christians. And one of the things that really was a starting motivation for the founding of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation was the concern that so much environmental policy, not just about climate, but on other issues as well, would really slow, stop, or even reverse the conquest of poverty for a lot of the world's poor. What have you observed, David, in terms of environmental policy that has a tendency to do that?
Part of the problem has been the idea of, as we talked earlier, about keeping things in the ground. The idea of not using energy, not inexpensive energy, making energy expensive so people can't use it. The question is then, how do we expect the poor in third world countries to develop? We allow them, of course, to use wind and solar. That is extremely expensive. It's not dispatchable. It has to be backed up unless you're willing to have intermittent energy and have the power end at any moment, at a moment's notice. Mm-hmm. And in particular being expensive. So very few people in the developed countries can afford it. You can't have much of it. And that's, I think, one of the bad things about making energy more expensive is you just simply make it difficult for the poor to survive in these third world type of conditions.
Yeah. And it's not energy only, but also, for example, the resistance to the use of artificial fertilizers, pesticides, insecticides, herbicides in agriculture. All of these things greatly increase crop yields, so that we now get as much as 40 or 50 times as much of many crops per acre than as we did 100 years ago. The result is that food becomes a whole lot less expensive for everybody, but also we use a whole lot less land. We just simply don't have to farm as much land in order to feed the human population. And so the strange thing about this is that it's environmentalists are opposing these fertilizers, these insecticides, herbicides, pesticides, on the grounds of protecting the environment. But in fact, if we followed their prescriptions, we would have to farm a whole lot more land. Well, that's exactly what is the greatest threat to biodiversity, to complex and varied ecosystems, is adopting bigger and bigger farmlands. So this is another way in which the environmental movement tends to harm the world's poor. Or take, for example, the opposition to the use of DDT. I mean, David, I think you've done some study on that and the results of it around the world.
Yeah, I mean, DDT saves people. I mean, the idea is if in malaria-ridden countries in particular, DDT is very useful. I mean, we used it in the United States to essentially kill off a whole cohort of mosquitoes, and DDT and malaria went with it. And removing wetlands was one part of the equation. DDT was another part. But since then, we have sort of prohibited many third world countries, in fact, paid them not to use it. And what that means is when you go to visit Nigeria, you have to be on anti-malarials because malaria runs wild in the country. You know, if you're out and about and you haven't been experiencing it, you're going to get very sick early on. Those who have had it a number of times can still get sick, but they sort of have a little bit of a tolerance build up. But the idea is it's just sort of we like to pretend that malaria is an endemic to all tropical areas and it will spread northward with climate change. In fact, we had malaria quite a bit in the United States. We were able to get rid of it. Some other countries were able to get rid of it, but now environmental policies are making it difficult to sort of rid things of malaria, yellow fever, and the like.
Yeah. David, I know that one of the claims of people who are concerned about global warming is that global warming will cause so-called tropical diseases to get more widespread around the world because more parts of the world will be warm enough for those diseases, for their vectors, the mosquitoes, to thrive. Well, first talk about, where and when does global warming driven by greenhouse gases primarily happen? Is it in the equatorial regions that we think of as the home of tropical diseases, or is it more, toward the higher latitudes? And does it raise warm temperatures more, or does it raise cold temperatures more?
Well, the expectation is that under climate change scenario, you're going to get warmer conditions in the polar regions and only slightly warmer conditions in the tropics. So the Earth should generally warm. That, in a sense, then releases the polar equator temperature gradient, which changes global circulation. But it's sort of a basic of physics. It says cold air is easier to warm than warm air. There's three reasons. One is the specific heat of dry air is less than the specific heat of moist air, and there's more moisture in warm moist air than there is in even cold moist air. The second thing is in the tropics, in the polar regions, you have a lot of ice, and there's a positive feedback that occurs when you melt ice. And the third thing is in the polar regions that you have when the ice is gone, you have the land surfaces that appear, and generally that land surface is darker, and so as a result, that warms up the surface. So you would expect a greater warming to take place in the polar regions than you would in the tropics. So that's the idea, is that if mid-latitudes and higher latitudes are warming more, that maybe these diseases will spread farther to the north. But as Paul Reiter found, I think he's at the Sorbonne in Paris, he may be back at the CDC, but he's bounced back between the two. But the idea is he's done a lot of research. And I remember him telling the story that they were that somehow cold kills off malaria, kills off the mosquitoes. And he says, he was right here in town in Memphis. He was in a sewer area, and he went in and found a mosquito and put it in a little vial and put it in his pocket. And he said by the time he got out, the warmth of his breast had warmed the vial. And the next thing you know, in there was the mosquito moving around again. So cold temperatures don't kill off mosquitoes. Malaria doesn't necessarily disappear that way. And like I said, it bothers a lot of people when they actually realize that the United States, in the early days of its settlement, were essentially malaria prone, and we've been able to get rid of that.
Yeah, in fact, Philadelphia was just full of malaria. In fact, during During George Washington's presidency, at one point, he was visiting Philadelphia, which at the time was, the headquarters of the American government. It was the capital. He was there in Philadelphia, and a malaria epidemic hit, and people were demanding he must leave the area to preserve his own health. And George Washington was a courageous man. He refused to do it. But what so many Americans don't realize is that malaria was endemic to 45 out of the 48 contiguous states of America up until the 1950s. And malaria has happened in Alaska. And of course, if you've ever been to Alaska or Minnesota, for example, during mosquito season, you know that mosquitoes don't have to have tropical temperatures to survive the winter.
Mm-hmm.
They do just fine. And going back to Paul Reiter, the greatest malaria epidemic in history, he says, was in Siberia, not in sub-Saharan Africa, not in India, not in Southeast Asia. It was in Siberia. So the notion that a little bit of global warming is going to spread malaria and other so-called tropical diseases around the world is craziness. And in fact, ironically, it's exactly the opposite of what we need to diminish the frequency, the extent, the spread of these diseases. Because the reality is that malaria, yellow fever, things like that, these are not diseases of geography. These are not tropical diseases. These are diseases of poverty. And as soon as a nation reaches enough wealth, it can take the actions necessary to control the population of whatever vector is spreading that disease. As long as it doesn't have that wealth, it can't do it. So when environmentalism embraces policies that slow, stop, or reverse the conquest of poverty in developing countries, it condemns them to longer years of high rates of disease from malaria, yellow fever, river blindness, on and on, all of these different insect-borne infectious diseases. So those are just a few tastes of the conference that David and I will be presenting this Friday and Saturday, April 1 and 2, Friday night, 6 o'clock to 9 p.m., Saturday morning, 9 a.m. to noon at Graceview Church, 7660 Swinnea Road. That's S-W-I-N-N-E-A, Swinnea, S-W-I-N-N-E-A. 7660 Swinnea Road, South Haven, Mississippi. South Haven, Mississippi. That's right on the south edge of Memphis, right close to the Memphis International Airport. There is no fee to attend this conference. Anyone is welcome to come. We would encourage you to register in advance on our website, because for those who do register in advance, we have two free educational resources to give to you on site there. So we certainly hope to see you there.
If I can't get there, how can I also see the presentations?
Right. This will be also live streamed on our Facebook page while we're doing this. So if you're too far away to come to Memphis, we'd love for you to see this on our Facebook live stream, just the way many of you are viewing this one right now. Now, before we wrap up, I noticed we did have one question from a viewer. If we can get that question back up on screen, let's address that. David, what is ESG, and how is it incorporated by the climate change group to mitigate a biblical worldview of free market enterprise?
That is a wide open question with lots of avenues that I won't be able to get to. ESG stands for Environment, Social, and Governance. And it is a procedure that is being used now to essentially evaluate companies, particularly to be able to find out how well do they stand on environmental issues, where do they stand on social issues, where do they stand on governmental issues. And of course, the idea is if you're following the good environmental socialist line, you'll get a very high score. If you're following the biblical capitalist type of line, you're going to get a much lower score. And so it's really the start of a stick. Used before, it was a carrot to get you to do these things. Now it's starting to be the stick to make you move along and get into line and start to follow things along. Yeah. And I've lost the rest of the question, but I think we're running low on time anyway. But
okay,
it's a wide open problem. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question.
Okay. ESG, environmental, social, and governance, is supposedly a guide for investors and a guide for consumers evaluating companies by how they measure up on those criteria. And it is very much being pushed by the climate alarmist movement around the world. And they want to use this as part of how they get companies to cooperate in reducing, eliminating man-made global warming. Not that the things that they want them to do would actually have any significant effect on global temperature or anything else about the global climate. They really won't, as we talked about earlier, quoting Ottmar Edenhofer, a co-chairman of the IPCC, quoting Gutierrez, the head of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, saying that this was our opportunity to change the economic development system of the world from capitalism to socialism. This is what is going on. They want to get rid of free market enterprise. They want to get rid of the biblical worldview and substitute a pantheistic or naturalistic worldview in its place. They want to get rid of capitalism and substitute socialism on the path to communism, and they want to get rid of the whole biblical worldview and ethics that gave us our Western civilization, our whole understanding of liberty and of justice and right reason and order in society. So I have a recommendation of a different group to go to get evaluations of companies. This is secondvote.org. That's 2ND vote, secondvote.org. It is an organization that was founded by a member of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation's Board of Trustees or Board of Directors, Dr. David Black. And secondvote.org evaluates companies, corporations around the United States by their charitable giving. Do they give to nonprofits, to causes that are consistent with biblical ethics, with biblical values and morality, or do they give to organizations whose values are contrary to biblical values? And there is also a related investment management firm, secondvote.com, Second Vote Investors. Second Vote Investors. If you're someone who invests in stocks and bonds and other securities, you want to be investing in companies that actually promote your values, don't try to destroy your values. So I would encourage you to go to Second Vote Investors, secondvote.com for the investments, secondvote.org to see the corporate evaluations and make your choices about where you're going to spend your money, where you're going to trust corporations. We would encourage you to support those that favor free markets and the biblical worldview and theology and ethics. Well, we're going to conclude with an announcement, and that is that for almost exactly 2 years now, started at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, when so many on-site meetings stopped happening. We had lots of opportunities for Cornwall Alliance people to speak at churches and schools and the like, and all of those dried up. And so 2 years ago, we began doing this live stream program that eventually we titled From the Stacks. And we did that as a way to reach out when we couldn't go physically there. Well, it's been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of hard work as well. And particularly for our wonderful producer, Jim Moline, who came on after a few months of my trying to do it myself and not doing very well. Jim has very, very generously for about a year and 8 or 9 months now completely donated his expertise, his equipment in producing this program for us. And so I want to say a very, very profound thank you to Jim right now. And but the time has come when, well, this good thing anyway, will come to an end. It's going to be replaced by a new podcast, a podcast that David and I will be doing together called Created to Reign. We're picking up on the biblical teaching that man is created in the image of God to have dominion over the earth. And so we're going to be talking about what it is to exercise godly dominion over the earth. This podcast so far is registered on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, Apple iTunes, and we'll be getting it registered on more as well. We have a trailer, an introductory bite on the online already. If you just search your favorite podcast searching mechanism for Created to Reign. Now there was a program by this name that had 3 episodes back in 2019 and never added any more. So don't be confused if you see that one. It's a very different program. But for Created to Reign from the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, we'd encourage you to go hear our trailer and be ready. We have just recorded the first 5 episodes of Created to Reign, and those should start going live in about another 2 weeks. And then we'll try to keep them going about once a week from then on. But it'll also be something that you can listen to very conveniently, just the way you do to any other podcast, anytime you want to, rather than as a live stream. So, David, I'm looking forward to doing that with you.
That'd be fun.
Yeah. And I want all of you to be very grateful to David, who is volunteering his time as Director of Research and Education. He's really doing a half-time job here at no pay, and we're very, very grateful for that. That's very, very generous of you. So, starting in a couple of weeks, we'll be seeing you on Created to Reign, or rather, you'll be hearing us anyway. Our last live stream from the stacks will be next week, and my guest next week will be Robert Bryce, author of a variety of different books on energy economics, energy engineering, particularly the fossil fuels versus wind and solar issues. He's been on the program before. He was one of the most popular guests of the past. So he's going to be sort of the capstone for the program next week. I hope to have you with us then. And after that, on Created to Reign, the new podcast of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. Meanwhile, thanks very much for joining us, and don't forget the opportunity to get your 2 free copies of Social Justice versus Biblical Justice by going to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, just enter promo code 22-03, that's promo code 22-03, or the title Social Justice, and we'll send you 2 free copies if you request them as our way of saying thanks when you make that 100% tax-deductible donation. So again, thank you very much for joining us tonight on From the Stacks. God bless you, and take care for the rest of the week.